So this morning we wrap up the sermon series called Blessed Be a Blessing, and we've been looking at episodes from the life of the family of God's people where they were a blessing to others. And we looked at 4 episodes, and these episodes were mainly about the patriarchs of the church, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And today we look at 2 women who appear nowhere else in God's Word. And I bet if I took a survey this morning and asked you to identify them, I would be surprised. Despite there's a lot of Bible scholars out here that if we could name who these 2 women are, these 2 women who were an absolute blessing and put their lives on the line to risk because they feared God. Their names were Shiprah and Puah. Let me set the stage. The family of Abraham, God's people, the Hebrews, moved lock, stock, and barrel to Egypt from the land that God had promised them. They moved there at the invitation of the Egyptian Pharaoh, and the whole lot of them, grandparents and parents and children, numbered about 70. And they lived in Egypt, and they lived in the very best land Egypt had to offer. They lived there for 400 years, and they did very well. Look at their story this morning with Exodus chapter 1, and it says, the people of Israel were fruitful, and they increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. However, in the very next sentence, we are told that they said that the Pharaoh suddenly looked around, and he saw those foreigners living among them, and he became concerned about national security. He was afraid that if they were invaded by a foreign power, if there was a war, that the Hebrews, who numbered by this time in the hundreds of thousands, would actually turn and fight against Egypt. So the Pharaoh made slaves out of them. He tried to break their spirit. He put slave masters over them. They built huge cities for Pharaoh, places where he could store his possessions and wealth. But an amazing thing happened when God's people were oppressed. And in fact, it's the same thing that happens always when God's people are oppressed. The more they were oppressed, the more they flourished. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. They spread. And the Egyptians feared them even more, and they continued to oppress them ruthlessly, attempting to break their spirits. And it didn't work. So Pharaoh took a radical step. Would not be the first time, would not be the last time that this had been attempted with God's people. He tried genocide. Listen to Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 through 16. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiprah and the other Puah, when you serve as a midwife of the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. So Shiprah and Puah were faced with a choice. They could either defy the most powerful man in the world or be faithful to God by protecting the powerless. Now, one of the most important ways that God's people are called to be a blessing to the world is by protecting the weak, protecting the powerless, those whom society deems expendable. There may be no more greater blessing, no more important contribution that the people of God have made to the world throughout our history than the idea that every human life has value, regardless of who they are, regardless of where they are from, what they have achieved, or we believe they can contribute to society. Every human life has value, so we have taught, because we are created in the image of God. And Jesus loves us. He loves us while we were sinners. He loves us while we are utterly common and routine members of a 7 billion person human race. He loves us despite the fact that we have shattered His law, that we have broken His commands, that we have willfully participated in open rebellion against Him. He has said, you are precious and honored in my sight, and I love you. No matter what anyone says to you, no matter what anyone does to you, no matter what you say or do to yourself, no one can rightfully minimize who you are or what God has created you to be. Now, they may do so, of course, but they would be absolutely wrong. And they'd be working against the will of the Lord of the cosmos, and He does not rule by majority vote. What a blessing. What a blessing. What a blessing of absolute, infinite worth and value. A blessing of eternal, undying purpose. A blessing of unshakable redemption. Shiprah and Puah, they understood this blessing. And they responded to be a blessing. So when the Pharaoh of Egypt, the most powerful man in the world, a man who was unstable, a man who was vengeful, who was ruthless and paranoid, commanded them personally to kill little male babies. They refused because they feared and followed the Lord. Verse 17 through 19. The midwives feared God, and they did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives to them and said, "Why have you done this? Let the male children live." And the midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous, and they give birth before the midwife comes to them." I'm just going to leave that alone, all right? We'll move on. I had some jokes there, but I'm not going to touch that. Well, what does it mean? What does it mean for the people of God to protect the powerless? What does it mean for the people of God to stand in the breach for those whom the culture or society or the government deems to be expendable? This is a basic practice of the people of God and a fundamental way that we are called to be a blessing to the world. And my friends, this world needs us to do this desperately right now. There were a couple of shootings this week, most notably in San Bernardino, which now appears to be an act of terrorism. The New York Daily News, which specializes in provocation, ran a cover, making headlines with this cover, saying God isn't helping this. God isn't helping this. They took exception to people saying we need to pray for the victims of shootings. But it raises the question, how are we as Christians, the people of God, the family of Abraham, what are we to do about it? How are we called to protect the weak and the powerless? What are we supposed to do when the world feels increasingly dangerous? When we see racism, or we hear other people decry racism, and maybe we don't see it ourselves, how are God's people, the family of Abraham, called to respond? How are we called to be a blessing? When people from foreign countries want to come to live as refugees in America, either legally or illegally, because of persecution or to escape poverty, what is our role as the people of God? When we encounter the homeless or children who are uncared for or who are unwanted, both born and unborn, how are the people of God to be a blessing? And how do we care for those communities in which the unborn are killed before they are born routinely? How do we care for them? How do we care for those women who are caught in that cycle? Right now, if I had to say the great fracture point in our society, the great cry is from those who feel neglected, from those who feel ignored, from those who feel stepped on and forgotten. And it cuts across every single demographic, every single one. And the role of the people of God is to do out of love for Jesus, even at great cost, what others are unwilling to do out of love of an institution or love of the other or love of an ideal or even love of country. There are three things we need to know about being this kind of blessing. There are three things we need to know this morning of being a blessing to the expendable and to the weak and to the powerless. The first thing we need to know this morning is the world needs us. The world needs the people of God to be a blessing. The world needs us desperately. Now, in this country, we have largely made the secular government an instrument of blessing. 60% of all government expenditures go toward caring for people. That's about $11,000 for every woman, man, and child. $11,000 for every woman, man, and child. And we do this out of a great desire to see people prosper and thrive and cared for. And we have by and large made charity a function of the state. And we have welfare, and we have food stamps, and we have health care for those who cannot afford it, and a whole litany of programs designed to care for the weak and the powerless and those on the margins. we have an ever-increasing network of agencies and laws and rules and regulations to make sure that no one is marginalized, to make sure that no one is discriminated against. And we have done our best as a society through rules and regulations and redistribution of wealth to create a society where all people, regardless of race or color or creed, can achieve their dreams. I don't know anyone who is satisfied with the results. I don't know anybody on the left or the right. Why? The state cannot do the work of the church. The state cannot do the work of the people of God. Governments and institutions and legislatures and bureaucracies cannot do what individuals transformed by the gospel can do. And we have a great example of this in this story. There was a time when the Pharaoh of Egypt loved God's people. He loved God's people. He gave them the very best land in Egypt. He assured them nothing would happen to them. But this story begins by telling us this Pharaoh, this new Pharaoh, he did not know that history. And he saw God's people as a threat to his throne, as a threat to his power. So he set out to crush them. And here's the problem with depending upon governments or the state or anything else beside the church to be an agent of blessing. Those institutions only bless those who they believe it is in their interest to bless. They only bless those who they believe it is in their interest to bless. The great tendency of those institutions, be it Pharaoh or a prince or a president or a precinct captain, is to protect their power. Protect their power. And for that reason, the first rule of politics is some have said, is to protect your friends and punish your enemies. My friends, that's not gospel. That's not gospel. Jesus commanded the people of God, love your enemies. Pray for those who hate you. Do good to them. And so the people of God, we don't need to protect our power because Jesus has given his power freely, and he will continue to give it in the form of the Holy Spirit poured out upon all flesh, lavishly, exorbitantly, and scandalously for those who will receive him. And so you had two women here formed by God who had the power to resist the mightiest man on the planet and save lives untold. Time and time again, throughout history, Abraham's family, the people of God, the church of Jesus Christ, our greatest contribution to the world has been holding society accountable for the dignity and the worth of every single human being. Every single one. Without Christianity, without the Word of God, there would be no such thing as human rights. There would be no Alexander Solzhenitsyn or Lech Walesa or John Paul II defying communism. Without Christians like William Wilberforce and Martin Luther King Jr. and Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and Fannie Lou Hamer standing up for righteousness, there would still be legalized slavery, segregated schools and hospitals and pools. Without Abraham's family following Jesus' example, women would still be treated like property. And without Christian thinkers, without the people of God like Thomas Aquinas and John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, there would be no civil liberties. There would be no freedoms or self-determination. Those great ideas, they're not the work of any other religion or faith or creed. They're the work of Christians transformed by the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so we live amidst and we breathe in and we take for granted these great social blessings because the family of Abraham sought to be a blessing. We quite literally, as Jesus said, the people of God, quite literally, are the light of the world. The light of the world. And if this world plunges into a dark age, it will ultimately be because the people of God sought to bless themselves. Sought to bless themselves. The second thing we need to know about these blessings is real blessing requires risk. It requires risk. We already spoke this morning about Shiprah and Puah, the risk they undertook to save these little Hebrew boy babies. Now, this Pharaoh was likely Amos. It was likely Amos. And Amos was very aggressive. He was a very proactive ruler. He was Pharaoh from the age of 10. And Amos, can you imagine putting a 10-year-old in charge of a nation? How would that work? Not too great. But he was very big on asserting his power. Very big on asserting his power. He kicked out every foreign ruler from Egypt. He built cities, as Exodus also tells us. He was the last Egyptian pharaoh to build pyramids. The very last one. He sent his armies all over the known world. His name meant Lord of Strength. Lord of Strength. And so these two midwives literally risked life and limb in defying him. And this risk, this living in the uncertainty and relying on God and trusting His command above all else, life without a visible safety net or a chicken exit. This is a gift. This is a gift. This is a rare and special gift. And it is something very few people get to experience before they begin to count their days, and then their hours, and finally their breaths. Earlier this year, I got to hear Dr. Kent Brantley speak. And Dr. Brantley was a missionary from India who traveled to Liberia as a medical missionary. And in 2013, he began to notice patients with a strange disease began to rampage that country, a disease called Ebola. And they evacuated all the missionaries and the doctors, and as others fled to safe countries and safe regions, Dr. Brantley stayed behind. Only one, out of every 20 patients he treated with Ebola survived. 1 out of 20. Eventually, he himself contracted the disease, and he had to be airlifted out of Liberia back to the U.S., where he received an experimental treatment. Experimental. That saved his life. And he shared why he stayed in Liberia and risked. He said, I learned there was so much more to being a physician than curing illness. That's not the most important thing we do. The most important thing we do is we enter into people's lives to share the tragedy and their joy and make a difference in the world. We enter into people's lives to share their tragedy and their joy and make a difference in the world. Now, the blessing you are blessed and called and gifted to give. It may not be at the risk of your life. You may not be called to stand up against a tyrant. You may not be called to heal a deadly disease. But I promise you this, you are called to risk. You are called to risk. You are called to bless by entering into someone else's life, to share their pains, to share their tragedies, to share their joys. And entering into someone else's life is always risky because you can't enter into someone else's life without at least exposing part of yourself. And that's a beautiful thing. That is a beautiful thing. That is a divine thing. In fact, it's a lot like Jesus, who entered into our life, not even to share our burden, but to carry it alone, blessing us tremendously. It's a great story. It's a great story about told by a Roman Christian historian about John, the same John who wrote the gospel that bears his name. John cared and led a young man with a rough history to know Jesus. And then John had to go away for a time, and he left this young man in the care of a bishop. And the bishop did his job initially, but relaxed when things sort of let up, and he got busy with other stuff, and it appeared the young man had turned the corner, and before long, the young man returned to his old life. Sometime later, John came back to town, and he asked the bishop about the young man, and the bishop replied, "I'm so sorry, John. The young man is dead." Meaning dead to God. He returned to his old life. He lives in a cave in the mountains. with a band of robbers, and he's now one of their leaders. And John, who by this time was really quite old, was just so broken by the news that the robe he was wearing, that he tore it. And then he immediately tore into the bishop for his neglect. And then he asked for a horse. And he got on the horse. And he rode to the cave and the den of robbers. And immediately they seized him. But that was John's plan. And he said to these rough men, "Take me to your leader." And the men brought him to the cave. And lo and behold, out came the young man carrying a sword. But as soon as the young man saw John, he began to run. But the old man, John, chased him down. He pursued him, and he said to him, "Why are you running from me? Don't be afraid. You still have hope of life. I will give up my life for yours, just as Jesus gave up his life for me." And so the young man stopped. He threw down his sword, and he began to weep and confess all that he had done before John. And John worked alongside him to come back to Jesus and to the church, which the young man did. Who is that person in your life? Who is that person in your life for whom Jesus is calling you to risk? Third and finally, if we're going to risk, we can risk with the assurance that God provides. God provides. Exodus 1, verses 20 through 21. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied, and they grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. So as we sit here this morning, here's what we want to know. Here's the question that we want to know. Here's what stands between us being the blessing that we want to be. Even the blessing we know we can be. It's this question: will I have enough? If I extend myself beyond what is comfortable or convenient, what will happen? Will God take care of me? Will I be embarrassed? Will I be shamed? Will I be ridiculed? Will I be mocked? Will I look like a fool? God will take care of you. The biblical answer is absolutely yes. So Shiprah and Puah took a risk. They extended themselves beyond what was comfortable. They literally put their necks on the line before a loose cannon of a king, and the Lord provided. He gave them families. The people of God grew strong. And he makes that same promise to you and me. Luke 6:38 says, "Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, it will be put into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you." And you may say to me this morning, "Well, Eric, come on. How do you know? How do you know? Eric, how do you know that if we give generously, that if we stand up for what is right, if we risk for those who are in danger or for the oppressed or for the broken, how will God provide? How can you be so sure? Is it just because you believe what this old book says? Look, the very pages are coming out of it. Yeah. But there's more. We have a guarantee. We have a guarantee. One of those little babies whose life was made possible by Shiprah and Puah's courage was a boy named Moses. It's a boy named Moses. And 80 years after Moses was born, God used Moses to lead his people from slavery into freedom. And for the next 40 years, they wandered in the desert until they found their home in the land God promised to Abraham's family 700 years before. And God told them in that rich land that they should be good to the orphan, and they should be good to the stranger, and they should take care of the widow, and they should care for the poor, and they should seek justice as well as they do righteousness. And when they did, they prospered. And when they did not, God rose up oppressive powers to discipline them, and they suffered. And they suffered because when they oppressed the poor, God had wanted them to know his justice. For 1,200 years, 1,200 years, empires rose and fell on their heads. The Philistines, and the Assyrians, and the Babylonians, and the Medes, and the Persians, and the Greeks, and the Romans. And then in the fullness of time, another little boy child was born. A boy child who we are promised will bring down the mighty from their thrones. And he will scatter the proud. And he will exalt the humble. And he will fill the hungry with good things. And the king, under whose reign this little baby was born, sought to take his life as well. And his name is Jesus. And he is the Son of God. And he is the Lord of all. He is the maker of heaven and earth. And this Jesus spent a lifetime, seeking out those crushed under society's wheel of injustice, loving the outcast, serving the sinner, leaving the 99 to pursue the one. And he died on a Roman cross for you and me as payment for our sin, and for the sin of the world. Do we really need any more proof that there is not one good thing this God will withhold from us? Paul wrote, "He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things?" And he is the blessing. He is the blessing. Not only for you and for me, but for all the families of the world. And we only know his fullness when we are a blessing too. You've been blessed. You've been blessed. Go be a blessing.